Even though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, for you are with me. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Today we move to verse 4 in Psalm 23. In the previous verse, in verse 3, we learn about how God cares for us by putting us on the right path. He leads us on paths of righteousness. The sheep have wandered away, and the shepherd goes and gets them and puts them back on the right path. So the sheep are on the right path, but the path leads through a dark valley. The dark valley is a foreboding, threatening, frightening, intimidating path. Especially for helpless sheep. Of course, we are always in that category, helpless sheep. Even after restoration and being put right, we remain helpless sheep in need of a shepherd. David starts verse 4 with, even though. We've all had some even though moments in our lives, haven't we? In Hebrew, this phrase is used to make a sentence emphatic. Instead of even though, we could translate it, especially when. Especially when I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil, because you are with me. It is especially when we are in the dark valley that we are most likely to be consumed with fear and anxiety. All of us have faced dark valleys in our lives. Some of you are facing a dark valley right now. When we hear the phrase dark valley, we somehow intuitively understand what it means, don't we? We somehow intuitively understand what the dark valley is. Dark valleys were etched into the lands. These grooves running through the desert are called wadis. These dark valleys were very dangerous places. They were places where predators lurked in the shadows, waiting to ambush prey who were trying to get a drink of water. And shepherds must lead their flocks through dark valleys to get to water and green pasture. But they are very dangerous, especially for sheep, but also for people. The road between Jerusalem and Jericho, where the Good Samaritan found the man who had been robbed, beaten, and left for dead on the side of the road, that was a wadi. That was a dark valley. It was called the Wadi Kelt, and you can see a picture of it here. If you notice in this picture, you can see they would have been walking down there in the bottom. You see how dark it is? You can barely make out the path. That narrow, tiny little groove. The road was a dark valley that travelers had to pass through if they wanted to make it from Jerusalem to Jericho. And these wadis were so narrow in some places that you didn't even really have room to turn around. So if you went into one, you were trapped. There was nowhere you could escape if you were confronted with danger. In Hebrew, when it says the valley of the shadow of death, it literally means the valley of the deepest darkness that you could imagine. It's terrifying to be in absolute darkness, not just for little children, but for us as well. Deprived of your senses, you cannot see to defend yourself or move around. You cannot see, so your mind starts to imagine dangers that might be there. The great master of suspense, Alfred Hitchcock, once said, "It's what you don't see that frightens you. What your mind fills in, the implicit usually being more terrifying than the explicit." Isn't this the very experience of anxiety? The unseen anxiety, what might be or what could be, or even sometimes what could have been. What we don't see, what we cannot see, terrifies us. And sometimes this anticipation of this fear is actually worse than whatever it is you're afraid of. It's the anxiety of the unseen. David, who wrote Psalm 23, knew many terrifying dark valleys in his life. He knew the dark valleys of his youth, where he would lead his flock of sheep to get water. He knew how to watch out for predators who were trying to grab his sheep and devour them when he went through dark valleys. He knew the dark valley of facing a giant warrior alone in battle as a teenager, while the mighty soldiers and even his own king were quaking with fear of Goliath. He knew the dark valley of watching his family disintegrate before his eyes. He knew the dark valley of being hunted by Saul for 10 years while he hid out in caves in these dark valleys, wondering if that would be the day that he would die. He knew the dark valley of his own son turning against him and trying to murder him. He knew intimately the fear of death, the dark valley of the shadow of death that we all must face. David knew all about dark valleys. But there was something else that David knew. David knew that he had walked through the dark valleys in his life, that he had made it through. He knew that the only way that he had made it through the dark valleys before was because God was with him. God had carried him through these dark valleys. And this gave him a secure confidence that he could make it through any dark valley that he faced. He had a secure confidence that he didn't have to fear any evil that might be lurking in the shadows. David knew the way to make it through the dark valley is to stay with the Good Shepherd. His presence, his protection carries us through the dark valley. God does not promise us in this passage or anywhere else that hard times won't come, but he promises to always be present, to never leave us nor forsake us. And it's here in verse 4 of Psalm 23 that we come to the climax of the whole psalm, the great turning point. The beating heart of Psalm 23 is right here in verse 4, when David says, "For you are with me. You are with me." Up until this point, David has been talking about the Good Shepherd to us. But that changes. Here in verse 4, he's no longer talking about the Good Shepherd. He's talking to the Good Shepherd. He says, "For you are with me." We have fallen from his gaze. He is no longer thinking about us. His eyes are fixed on the Good Shepherd, and he's making a prayer to the Good Shepherd saying, "You are with me. I'm talking to you, Lord." When I was in preschool, I broke my femur and had to be hospitalized for several weeks. And I was completely immobilized in a body cast from basically my belly button all the way down. And they had me in this weird harness thing. I think it's called traction. I don't know what it's called now. Yeah, we got a nurse right here. So they had me in traction. And so as a 4-year-old, I was harnessed up in this hospital bed, completely immobilized from the cast and from being in traction. And as you might imagine, this was a fairly traumatic event for a 4-year-old, and one which I remember vividly. But in the midst of the pain and suffering, there was one fear that dominated all my thoughts and feelings. My one fear was that I would wake up in that hospital room and find myself alone, that no one would be there. And one afternoon, that's exactly what happened. I woke up in the hospital room, and I was completely alone. My parents had faithfully stayed by me in shifts, but when I'd fallen asleep, they'd both left, I think, to go get some food, and they were coming right back. But I didn't know that as a 4-year-old. They were probably only gone for about 15 minutes. And so when I was alone, I was completely terrified, and basically, I totally freaked out. I managed to flip my whole body over in traction, get half of my body out of the bed, and I was trying desperately to crawl my way to the door to find someone, anyone, so that I wouldn't be alone. I was desperate for the presence of my mom and my dad. I was like a sheep, desperate for the presence of the shepherd in the dark valley. Have you ever felt that way in the dark valley? Alone and filled with anxiety, desperate for anyone to be with you? Here again, the secure confidence of David as he says to the Good Shepherd, "You are with me. Even when I am alone, I know that I am never alone." David knew that he never had to face a dark valley alone. Do you know that? Do you know that you never have to face a dark valley alone? Are we as desperate for the presence of God in the dark valley as I was desperate for my parents in that hospital room? Are we as desperate for the presence of God to know that he is with us when we're in the dark valley? The hard reality is that we can't make it through the dark valley on our own. But the good news of the gospel is that we don't have to. We don't have to make it through alone. You know, I've often wondered about this passage because for me, the presence of the Lord is enough, right? But David doesn't stop there. He doesn't stop with the presence of the Lord. He goes on to say, "Your rod and your staff, they comfort me." It's almost like he's explaining why the presence of the Lord makes him not afraid in the dark valley. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. The rod and staff symbolize God's power to protect us, that he is powerful enough to protect us from external dangers and threats, and strong enough to protect us from internal dangers. The shepherd's rod would have been a short club made out of wood. And this drawing is not perfect. It's a little cartoonish. I don't really like it, but it's the best that I could find. But you can see the difference between the rod and the staff. The rod was this relatively short club that shepherds would carry to beat back predators. And they would often take a piece of wood that had a big knot on the end, and they would drive nails into that knot so that when something came along trying to steal their sheep, they would bash it with the rod. They would beat off the predators with the rod. It wasn't used on the sheep, that little short rod. It wasn't used to hit the sheep. It was used to beat off predators from the sheep. Before the teenager David goes to fight Goliath, King Saul is trying to talk him out of it. But listen to how David responds. And I think this is going to tell you why he writes this in Psalm 23. Listen to this from 1 Samuel 17:34-36. This is what David is saying to King Saul. "Your servant used to keep sheep for his father, and when there came a lion or a bear and took a lamb from the flock, I went after him and struck him and delivered it out of his mouth. And if he arose against me, I caught him by his beard and struck him and killed him. Your servant has struck down both lions and bears, and this uncircumcised Philistine shall be like one of them, for he has defied the armies of the living God." Isn't David cool? He's very cool. David used a rod to lay the smackdown on lions and bears. That's what he's thinking of when he wrote, "Your rod comforts me." This is another image that I found. This is an image of a young shepherd boy. It's taken a little while ago, but it's not as old as it looks. And what you can see him carrying there are the two weapons that David would carry. One is the rod over his shoulder, and the other one is the sling with the stone in it. They would use these weapons to defend their flock, to drive back the predators. When we are with the Lord, his rod comforts us because we know that he is powerful enough to beat back the predators that want to consume us. Do you know what makes up the majority of Jesus' miracles in the Gospels? Do you know what he did more than anything else? What miracle he performed more than any other? Exorcism. That's right. It's like you went to seminary or something, Megan. The number one miracle in the Gospels is exorcism, driving back and driving out the demonic forces that are assaulting God's sheep. Jesus came out, and when he saw these people being assaulted by the forces of evil, he pulled out his rod and he drove out the demons. Not literally, like didn't go beat them with a rod, but he spiritually drove them out. With a single word, Jesus had the power to cast out and cast down an entire army of demons that were oppressing a man. That's how powerful Jesus was. Wherever Jesus encountered the forces of evil attacking and oppressing his sheep, he struck them down, just like David would rescue those lambs from the mouth of the lion and bear. But the ultimate rod of the Good Shepherd, the ultimate weapon that he uses to beat back evil is the cross. Just like the lions and bears. Remember in that passage in 1 Samuel 17, it said that sometimes the lions and bears would rise against me. They weren't just going after the lambs, they were rising up against me. Just like the lions and bears would rise against David, and he would strike them down with his rod. Death, the ultimate enemy, rose up against Jesus and tried to kill him. But Jesus struck down death when he rose from the grave. The cross of Christ, his death and resurrection, at the very moment when death tried to swallow him up, Jesus struck down death itself. His mighty rod, the cross, was the final death blow to death itself, because death could never hold the Lord of life. So that's the rod. Second, the second sign of God's protection, the shepherd has a staff. And you can see it's this longer, thinner one with a hook or a crook on the end of it. And the shepherd would use this to grab the sheep when they were going off course. When they were about to walk off a cliff, the shepherd would reach out and grab them and pull them back in to safety. Did I mention how helpless and stupid sheep are, that they would walk off a cliff? But they will. And so the Good Shepherd not only protects us from external dangers, he protects us from internal dangers, the dangers we pose to ourselves. Not only has the Good Shepherd Jesus laid the smackdown on hell and death, but he has rescued us from the ways that we have destroyed our own lives, from our own sins. His staff is a symbol of his rescue. His staff comforts us because when we come to him, he forgives our sins, and he rescues us out of the wrong path that we were on that was leading to danger, and he sets us on the right path. His staff brings us comfort because you cannot dig yourself into a deep enough hole that the shepherd's staff cannot reach you. He can always reach down and pull you up. There is no level of sin that you can get to that God cannot forgive you and pull you back up. God's protection, again, doesn't mean that bad things won't happen to us. As I said before, sometimes that right path leads right through the dark valley. This past Wednesday, we talked about the gripping story of Perpetua and Felicity, two early church martyrs who were killed for their faith. And some of you reflected back to me how disturbing that story was. These young mothers who had just had infant children being killed and martyred for their faith and having to set aside their own children, and how disturbing and shocking that story was to you. How they were literally piled in a hole in the ground with their companions in the stifling heat. They knew the dark valley. They knew the dark valley of being locked in prison and separated from their children. But what they also knew, just like David, with secure confidence, was that the Good Shepherd had not left them, and that they would be victorious over death, that not even death could have any victory or hold over them. It's astonishing for us to read about their steady confidence and even joy while facing certain death. But they could do that. They could face death without fear because they knew the Good Shepherd was with them in the dark valley. In fact, she writes that she'd never more experienced the presence of the Lord than when she was in that dark valley. His rod gave them victory over death. They knew that Jesus had conquered death by dying on the cross and rising again, and that death would never swallow them up. They knew that his staff was long enough to reach them and save them. They had protection from without and protection from within. Your rod and your staff, they comfort me. Do you know that? You may face dark valleys in the future. You may be in a dark valley right now. The promise of Psalm 23 is this: we do not have to be afraid or anxious in the dark valley because he is with us. If you are with the Good Shepherd, you have his presence and protection over you, and he will get you through it. Sheep with the shepherd and sheep without a shepherd are totally different in the dark valley. They're totally different. We can have a secure confidence that the Good Shepherd is with us and that we do not need to be afraid. So the next time you face a dark valley, that might be today, right now. But whenever that is, because you will face a dark valley in your life, the death of a loved one, and a crushing anxiety about your future or money, past mistakes that you made that come back and haunt you. You will face a dark valley. I can promise you that. When you face that dark valley, you can say with David, I will fear no evil because you are with me. You are with me. And your rod and your staff, they comfort me. It's a simple prayer, but one that we all need. We have to remind ourselves again and again that his rod and his staff are there to beat back our enemies, the devil, all the forces of evil, and even death itself. And his staff is always ready to reach down and scoop us up whenever we fall, whenever we go off the path. When the Lord is our shepherd, we need not fear death or any other anxiety in the dark valley. His rod and his staff. His rod and his staff are there to comfort you. And he will always, always get you through the dark valley. Amen.